have a little bit of a break because we do have people on the hour finishing a class running in, and we want to give them an opportunity to do that. But we also always listen to your feedback, and we got some feedback that the 5-minute gap at the start is a little bit annoying, right, for people that are sitting there waiting. So we went through our introductions. We'll do that. We've had a shorter gap. We'll still give a little bit for people transitioning. But look, if you missed the beginning of it, it's okay. If you know something missed the beginning of it, as you guys know, these are all recorded. They'll live on the YouTube page as well as supplemental videos. So you can go back and see what you missed, which will just be pleasantries and introductions. So with that, we want to jump right in. Hopefully you all know me, but if not by now, welcome. If it's your first webinar, I'm Stefan Underwood, our Director of Continuous Improvement. And definitely really excited to have our friend John Wolf here, who is I always thought I had a cool title in Director of Continuous Improvement. He's got a cooler title. He is the CFO, but nothing to do with finance. He's the Chief Fitness Officer for Onnit. So I'll shut up, but with that, introduce and say thank you for coming, John Wolf.
Hey, thanks for having me out, Stefan, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to all of you remotely. I can see myself on the camera, but can't see all of you. Hopefully, we'll have a really good time. Essentially, like Stefan said, I have a really cool title, a really cool job. You may have been familiarized with our brand of Onnit just through announcements internally, and we're really excited about this partnership. We hope to bring some new perspectives to the table, and in today, when we talk about offset load, we're also going to be talking about a relatively new piece of equipment. So realistically, hey, nobody wants to be lectured to for a full hour without some visual stimulus. So we're going to kind of mix and match some going over some principles in a more broad and general sense, and some visual stimulus in terms of like, hey, let's just make sure we put into practice what it is we're talking about for you guys to be able to see and basically deduce what we're inferring or what we're speaking to. And so as we talk about today, introduction to offset load, I think that it's really important that we come to terms with maybe some language that is common or is varied between our organizations. So if I refer to something a certain way or a principle, then we can tie those things together, the things that we value in the system that we teach at Onnit in terms of movement and fitness education, and then the Exos system as well. And so what's been really great is that the more that we've interacted across our different organizations and the more coaches and therapists have come through Onnit education, we're speaking the same language. It's just the fact that sometimes the words we use to describe the same things are varied to some degree, but the underlying principles and the thought process is more often than not very, very aligned. Would you say that's the case, Stephen?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that's the case. So a couple of us got to early on with this partnership go out to Onnit and check out their foundations course to learn a bit about their education. And we'll go in at the end. We'll talk about how you can do that if you are unaware, but they've been gracious to give us a really good discount, and it's a great way to go get some education. But right away when I stepped in, Eric Dannenberg, who's the manager here in Arizona, we stepped in and right away we started noticing some things we'll talk about here. In their system, they talk about static, fluid, dynamic. We talk about position, pattern, power, but we're all saying the same things as a principle. If you need to own the positions that you're asking people to move to, then pattern them smoothly at varying paces before you then add performance qualities. So I definitely agree. And with that, that's probably a good place to jump into some of our initial principles that don't actually even relate to offset load, right? We're just going to start with key principles. I think one thing we want to make clear is this is not a webinar about the mace. We're going to use the mace a lot, and it's fun. I've been enjoying it myself, but we don't want you to think that you're going to get nothing out of this if you don't have maces at your site, right? We're going to talk about key principles for progressions, regressions, adding variability, variety, complexity in all of your training. So with that in mind, why don't you take us off and key principles just to do with progressing and regressing anything?
Yeah, and I think that's realistically, I think what we both really value is that we want to create a framework that allow you as coaches to understand how to progress and regress any movement and work with any tool once you understand just the foundational concept behind the use of those tools. I always like to say, hey, put me on a beach with a rock and a stick. I'll put together 2 new fitness systems, in a couple of days really easily. And so that's something that we really want to make sure we're continually hit on. So the first thing that we want to look at is the relative position of the implement. And today what we're going to do is use something relatively familiar, or very familiar. In the case, we're going to use a power block dumbbell to just highlight different positions. So depending upon, I'll let Stefan kind of demo because he wants to show off his new guns after the hypertrophy webinar he did last time.
I've never grown in my entire life.
I saw the notes for it, and I saw him putting in some work. I know he does a lot of work. I don't know why the muscle isn't showing up. And I've seen him eat too. So, all right. So now if we have the dumbbell, we have something in terms of the centration of the load. You're interacting with this weight at the center of mass. So that's really interesting and really something contrary to what the concept of what we're doing here is, but not necessarily in the situation because it's unilateral load, right? There's an asymmetry here in the sense of where his midline is relative to the distribution of load. This is offset to some degree already.
Right.
And so to the opposite effect, now with this bilateral load, now he is not offset, right? So this basic concept of just having a single dumbbell and understanding how that adds a new variable is something that we can discuss as an entry point to introducing an offset load concept. So in this case, we got basically the hang position, right? And the dumbbell in the hang position. And if we just look at, well, let's go ahead and look into basically changing his base. So if we were into a reverse lunge, let's just say, and he comes back out of a reverse lunge in the hang position, that's going to be different from a secondary position, a rack-like position here. Okay, so same thing, reverse lunge. Boom. All right, now, hey, let's make this a little more difficult and go overhead. So the position of the implement drives the progression or regression of the skill as well as anything else. And hey, you know what? That's a principle that applies to any tool, right? The relative positioning of the tool drives potential structural challenge to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives us variety for our clients. And as you got a large class, you got people who've been coming for a long time versus a short time.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different to say, hey, we're working on a lunge out of a suitcase position.
Mm-hmm.
I want you in a rack position. And then, person who's been coming a long time, Sally, we're going to just work through lunges with an overhead position. And it fully changes the dynamic of that exercise.
Yeah, definitely. And just off that, hey, that overhead position tends to be a nice challenge. I already hear Stefan breathing a little bit here now. It's okay. Stay tall, stay tall. All right. So, hey, I'm glad I'm not the one demoing and talking at the same time. Otherwise, you'd hear me breathing pretty heavy, and I'm the one that's mic'd up. So, so let's just go ahead and go through that. I'm pretty used to that type of presentation as well. I don't really mind, but it's nice to have Stefan here. And I think also, hopefully, it'll continue the dialogue of the thoughts between our systems. But so now let's just go and say, okay, so you have the relative position of the implement to your body, right? And now let's look at, well, what about the position of the body itself and scaling it even in a similar movement pattern, right? Or base movement, we can look at, well, hey, how do we both look at these things? So, a lot of times you guys have broad movement categories, right? Upper body push, upper body pull, lower body push, lower body pull, right? And then you break that down into specific movement types.
One leg, two leg, hip dominant, knee dominant, one arm, two arm, vertical, horizontal, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. So we can break down movements into categories and subcategories to understand how we're analyzing and qualifying and quantifying those movements, right? And so for us, we really, in our system, we're really looking at trying to keep things in 3 to 4 buckets for the most part. And so we look for ways to narrow the focus in the categories into 3 to 4s at all times, right? And sometimes you have nested categories, like you guys have the methods to the systems above them, right? As we discussed. And so in this situation, we're looking at, squat, hinge, push, pull is the more broad movement categories that we like to classify things in. And then we contextualize different variables within those categories, right? Between those base movements, those foundational movement skills. So in this case, let's just look at the lunge again, right?
Sure.
And so let's just go from a regress to a progressed thought process. And in this case, well, let's start with a half kneeling position. All right. And so if we're in a half kneeling position, we have the opportunity to have a relatively stable base. We have the rear toe, knee, and the front foot all in contact with the ground. We have the opportunity to refine our positional awareness at this bottom position, right? And from here, hey, what's the next thing going up from there? Let's go ahead and change the relative stability by taking the knee off the ground into a static split squat position. All right, Awesome. So look at Stefan's always refining his position, being very aware of where his center is, ribs relative to pelvis, nice neutral spine. Hey, from there, let's go ahead and look at a reverse lunge. So now we're moving towards a more dynamic drill. But in this situation, as we're doing this, we're more focused on that second step of patterning. So I'd be looking at, well, how smooth are the transitions that Stefan is going through this movement and this pattern through? Is it choppy, or is it accelerating unknowingly to him, or is he able to eccentrically load in a very smooth and fluid manner and come out of that fluid if that's what I dictate? And like you said, we can dictate the speed to a greater extent by dictating tempo or changing the cues, right?
I think that's a key point, is looking at how we look at these things. So next month's webinar is going to be on error identification and correction.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest errors we'll see is, let alone positioning, and this is something I took away from the Onnit course I went, is people trying to rush through positions they can't own. That person who's sort of at the bottom, quick up, gotta build momentum and push up. First, that ability to show control throughout, bring intent, and not have to speed out of any position, but show like this smooth movement. That once I can own this with the right lines, the right angles, and all of that, it very quickly in time progresses to that. But you can't do that until you can show control on that single leg. Yep. So principally, like from a sound principle standpoint, we can progress regress based on body position. Half kneel, half kneel progresses easily into a split squat or an isometric even, and we'll talk about intent later.
Mm-hmm.
Into reverse lunge, into more deceleration, into our walking lunges. So
exactly.
And now if you would add that to the first principle,
you have a lot of variables you're managing already.
I've got isometric split squats here. I've got isometric split squats here. I've got isometric split squats here. I've got reverse lunges here. I've got reverse lunges here. I've got reverse lunges here. And you start seeing a lot of the variety you can bring. Not even talking about offset load yet.
Nope.
Variety you can bring to any class.
Yeah. So implement position, if we're using an implement, right? If not, then you can change your hand positions as a loading mechanism, right? Like going overhead, going into maybe a prisoner or something like that, versus hanging the arms, which is load. It's just not necessarily external load, right? And secondarily, then the body position, the relative body position, and using the framework of classifications of movement, categories of movement to quantify, qualify the progression or regression. The right choice is often right below the threshold of where your client or athlete is able to perform well, right? We're kind of finding that nice balance of challenge and accessibility, right? And
so
then
we sort of teased. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say we sort of teased the third principle.
Exactly.
That split jump, right? Like now there's
velocity. So, and this is something that Stefan already spoke to. We already talked about how we categorize movements, right? But now we also talk about the 3 Ps, or in our case, static, fluid, dynamic. So position, pattern, power, static, fluid, dynamic. Hey, essentially, if we just look through position relative to static, so positional dominance, positional awareness, positional control, setting the end ranges before we even try to move under load, understanding what the capacity for movement of the body is and how much control at those end ranges there potentially are.
Which brings back that conversation of intent and makes me think you're about to make me work a little bit.
Maybe, so in this case situation, let's just get into that split squat position, and we'll use this as our static, right? So that rear knee is elevated, and we can change the intrinsic experience that Stefan has by giving him verbal cues and giving him assignments that vary the position. So holding the position's one, right? That's awesome. We could take hands off of thigh. That's going to add a little bit more demand on the trunk and torso. Now, we can also change the intent with how he engages the floor. So one thing I would like him to do is squeeze the feet together, and notice how that gives him a rotational bias. The rear hip likes to drive forward. Hey, what about if we push the feet apart? You hear him breathing, and you see him working. If you see, there's a nice vibration going on here, and come right out of the split squat. All right, so even on a short timeline, that amount of engagement, and Stefan's always good at giving 100% of his intent. As we've worked together a couple of times during presentations, he likes to demonstrate for those people that we're working with, whether it's on the webinar or in person, the amount of intent that he hopes that they would put forth in their efforts.
Yeah, and I'll call something out right away. Like, what about our industry favorite planks?
Yes.
right? Like I can hang out here all day long, have a conversation. Like there's really not much struggle going on right here, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the end of the world. John cues me up to have my hands apart, pull my elbows to my toes, create tension, fire up my lats, and still be able to breathe through that.
Ooh, yeah, it's a little harder to breathe behind the shield there, like they say,
And very
right?
quickly, yeah, breathing behind the brace, breathe behind the shield, and all of a sudden you realize there's a whole different intent. And then you read, McGill's work on we only need to be doing planks for 10 seconds at a time. We don't need to hang out for 2, 3, 4 minutes in a plank, but 10-second reps, generating tension and breathing behind that brace is a whole new dynamic, and my heart rate is up just on bringing intent without even having an implement in my hand.
Exactly.
So
all those respiratory muscles are working against load there too. And so what was really great about that understanding is it also brings to mind something that we can highlight really quickly is when we're looking at movement and we're qualifying or quantifying qualitatively what's happening. A lot of times, and we look at the mace and we look at a lot of things that we're swinging or even just holding positions. In the plank, we can say, what is the plank at its most fundamental basis is anti-extension drill. You're trying to keep the front line engaged and keep the ribs and the front of the pelvis in a relatively static configuration with each other, right? So neutral, and with that isometric pull that you did in through the ground,
right,
it really predisposes that front line to stay engaged, right?
right, absolutely.
Awesome. So I think they're liking watching you work, by the way.
Probably.
Okay.
Probably. I'm not hypertrophy when I put Colin through his paces, so I deserve my due. It's the altitude here is killing me.
All right, yeah. Is that what it was? I was running over to the other facility.
1,000 feet. It's definitely the altitude.
Well, I'm from Monterey, which is kind of below sea level.
Exactly.
So,
right? So you come up. So I mean, if we look at those 3 principles, right? Like before we jump into offset load here, change the way the implement interacts with your clients. Simply change the way they have to hold it. Everyone's working the same position. Change where the implement lives.
Yeah.
Okay. Or change, progress, or regress the position itself.
Yep.
Right. Or change the velocity. You notice we didn't jump right to the fast. We actually went to the slow. Exactly. Isometrics, owning positions. That we talk about position. You talk about static. That static element of owning that. That once I've absolutely got people creating tension, being able to breathe and work here, now we can progress to that fluid movement, and now we can ask them to take off and know that they'll control the landing without this complete collapse of torso and without looking sloppy, because we've owned that bottom position already with static isometric work.
Yeah, we call it positional landmarks a lot of times in our system, or movement landmarks. So even knowing when to transition and change direction. Maybe in this situation, maybe Stefan has an issue that makes a red light at certain depth. And maybe we know that because we set positional awareness, and now he knows to stay above that threshold, to stay behind that line rather than crossing over that line into discomfort or pain, transitioning into pain.
Right.
And of course, we know that pain alters movement to a great degree, and it changes the experience from something that hopefully is very positive, we can adapt to positively, to something that's more than likely going to reinforce dysfunction to some degree, because we're going to move away from an ideal execution of movement.
Right. And so those are 3 sound principles: change the implement, change the body position, change the velocity.
Yep.
And they're all going to then get amplified by offset load. So this is a webinar about introducing offset load, which you've already hinted that we're doing somewhat as soon as we go to a single arm dumbbell.
Exactly.
But how do we add variety without even going to the mace yet? Let's introduce principles of offset load and ways to play.
I think we have this handy dandy barbell here, right? And what we can
1 rep max.
1 rep max. He's Captain America. He's taking the super soldier serum. Eventually, that's going to kick in, and there's going to be more muscle on this frame.
As a Canadian, this is the first time I've used these plates.
Oh, no Captain Canuck. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. All right. So now what we're actually going to do is we're not going to change the principles we're discussing, but we're going to discuss how the offset load, as Stefan said, amplifies the effect of those principles, and also amplifies your ability as a coach to see things that you wouldn't necessarily see in a bilateral load or bilateral stance as easily. So what you're going to see is the predisposition for things to happen naturally without exerting a lot of control. So let's just go ahead and say, okay, as a setup, just to create a base of framework, a landmark, essentially, a reference point, let's go ahead and have Stefan set up for a conventional deadlift. And so what we're going to use is something that's very familiar to anybody in the strength game is a deadlift. And so we're going to have Stefan do a simple 1 rep deadlift to the top, and then 3 RDLs, partial range RDLs here, so that he feels basically he's under load even at the end range at the bottom. All right, and now we're going to go ahead and put the bell down. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually reduce the actual load on the bar.
Yeah,
and see what does that mean? You know, okay, well, that means usually easier, doesn't it not?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so if I reduce load, and most people as coaches, we're managing load as one of the key variables of managing progression and regression, right? And so now I want you guys to think about load, not only in the sense of total load, but the placement of that load and the relative demand on the structure. And now we've reduced the load. This is a 35-pound bar and a 25-pound plate. Before we had 2 25-pound plates. So it's a pretty drastic reduction in load, not quite a third of the total load, but pretty significant. Now we're going to look at highlighting some of the things that we discussed. It's an amplification, we said. So as Stefan sets up, he's going to centrate his body right at the center of the bar. Okay, and now he's going to grip the bar in an evenly distributed orientation, just like he did before. The goal here is as he engages the bar, he's going to pre-tense his body and try to anticipate the way that the bar is going to load his body before he moves the bar. And he's going to go ahead and do a 1 rep deadlift. Holding at the top, there's a ton of information going through his body right now. There's a lot of activity, and he's trying to centrate his body on the bar. What does the bar naturally want to do, Stefan?
All day.
All day. So he has to create a push-pull environment with his body, driving his far hand in towards his midline and pulling his near hand, the loaded hand, away from midline. Now let's go ahead and get those 3 reps under control. And this also drives the natural predisposition to keep that bar nice and horizontal. What do you have to do, Stefan? Do you have to move faster or slower?
I've got to control it. I got to move slow.
Yeah, go ahead and put it down. And so what happens is we create a very sensory rich environment where if the goal is to make the bar appear as if it's bilaterally loaded by keeping that nice horizontal line, by keeping your body centrated on the bar, then we drastically amplify the neural load, and the intrinsic musculature has to fire at a very fast rate. It becomes something not only about brute strength, but sensitivity and what was the word we were like? Reflexive strength.
Stability.
Yeah, strength and stability. So let me just ask right now. So as we reduce the load, did it make the drill easier?
No, it felt significantly harder. And we talk about rotational forces a lot in our system and the need for anti-rotation as well as that anti-extension, anti-flexion. And right away, I just felt like it was all right here, and anti-rotation. Yeah. I'm already thinking about loading different ways, right? Like if I take this press and put on my back, it's an axial load, so there is still an anti-rotation force, but maybe less than in this bent over position. It's truly trying to torque the spine.
Exactly. As you get more horizontal, it's more true anti-rotational load.
But there's still going to be in this load, as I now walk through lunges, and I'm talking about whether it's when I'm lunging when the weight is loaded on the stable side versus the unstable side, how that will change the dynamic. But what's really cool for especially a lot of our people watching in a corporate setting or in a working with Gen Pop, risk of injury, as long as they understand spinal integrity. We got to watch that anti-rotation has been built into and start light. Maybe it's not a full plate. Maybe we start with a 5-pound plate here.
Or just a slight variance in the total load. So if we had maybe a 35-pound plate on one side and a 25-pound plate on the other side, even though that's more weight on the bar, the actual demand structurally is significantly less.
Right. But at the end of the day, if that's on my back, I know I can make myself work, but there's very low relative load on me. It's a safe environment to really challenge people in new and intriguing ways that also transfers to life, because, you know, this is the one thing I really learned working in the military. Life very seldom asks us for a strength task in which we have perfectly distributed weight with a nice grippable, knurled, small, symmetrical object, right? Like guys out in the field lifting things into the back of a truck aren't like, wow, like look at my ability to deadlift this beautifully symmetric implement.
Yeah.
So we talk about transfer to life, safe because there's less weight, and then me as the client getting that perception of working really hard.
Exactly. So, and what's really great about this is what we also see is dosing for something like this can be very low and have a huge carryover into awareness of your position and structural integrity when we get back into, we can use this as a primer, we can use this as a complement to your other work very often. And in this case, so we use the barbell to kind of highlight this, but when we look at, we look at the relative position of the load, we looked at centrating, but what if we wanted to make it easier with the same weight? How would we do that?
You want to talk about distance from midline?
Yeah, distance from midline.
The degree of offset?
Exactly. So we have this long bar, right? And with the same amount of weight, we can really make this a lot easier. And we're going to carry this over into the other tool that we're highlighting today as well, but keeping proximal to the load, right? So the offset load is where the plate is, and having Stefan kind of centrate his body with his hand proximal to that load, and then doing the same deadlift. The load is still offset, but to a much lesser degree. And how much easier is that?
A lot easier.
It's a lot easier.
I know that one of the fun challenges we used to put with the military guys was we had a standard plate and bar to see who could make a symmetrical deadlift where it looks symmetrical as far away as possible. So you get guys trying to, which I'm clearly not going to be able to, pick up that fully offset bar, and you see that right away. Put me into, I started doing things, right?
And this is, what's great about this offset load concept is essentially people are at the mercy of their internal lines of tension and they're not symmetrical. So a lot of times, even in a bilateral stance, we're seeing people give up relative position to forces that are internal before we even load them externally. So a lot of times what these external loads do is we are asymmetrically load the body, gives the body an opportunity to kind of work within a constraint-based environment to self-regulate where center is, And this is something we've talked about a lot, is we really like to highlight being centered and being kind of moderate in our approaches, like have a holistic approach to wellness and fitness, and as well kind of owning your center, owning the ground you stand on in your movement potential. That gives you the greatest amount of movement potential variability as well, right? So if I'm centrated, if I know where my center is, I can move in any direction with a less bias, right? I'm not overcommitted in one direction.
Right. So we talk about basically distance from midline as the key principle, that length of the lever arm or lever arm for the Americans on the call.
Yeah.
The length of the lever arm, right, and distance from midline as the key principle, which amplifies our first principle for all that we talked about, was position of the implement.
Exactly.
Right.
And then we can do position of the body. In this case, hey, this is a relatively light load. Let's go ahead and just move you closer to that. Let's do this just with this weight, since we've already highlighted it. Let's go ahead and bring it up into a rack position, but keep you proximal to the load. Okay. So in this case, moving the load higher actually changed the orientation of the hands. With one, when it was hanging.
And should I have it racked?
No, actually, I want this a more neutral position with the wrist so that you can actually stay in a relatively high tension field. So you can controlling that push pull. As soon as you go into a conventional rack, you generally lose the hands and you're gonna probably lose control of this far end of the bar. So let's just say, okay, we looked at a hang to a rack to an overhead position. And in this case, we look at that overhead position and we have a lot more challenge in that overhead position, right? So pulling down under control. So control the descent, boom. And again, being in this offset environment, to control the horizontal orientation of the bar, Stefan actually has to stay a lot more engaged through the whole process, right? Go ahead and bring it down. So now we looked at, well, not even within the same movement pattern, but we look from a deadlift to a clean to an overhead press. And even as we move up the body, the relative position of the body or the changing the body movement type actually changed the way that the load interacted with it as well.
Absolutely.
So before we get into the next part of this and kind of amplifying or highlighting this constraints-based model, let's move the barbell out of this scene here, because maybe now is a great time to introduce the mace and why the mace might be a more ideal tool in a broader sense. I think everybody has access to a barbell. We all have access to dumbbells, so we can conceptually understand what we're talking about thus far with those tools. But something that the mace, when we look at, just look at the lever length, right, or lever length, right?
For the Canadians on the call.
Yeah, and the total load. So the bar with a 25-pound plate, even though it's a 35-pound bar, is still 60 total pounds with a relatively large lever. Right, and the lever amplifies the perceived load, the effective load of the body. And so what we want to look at is, well, hey, is that the ideal way to introduce it to more broad populations, right? And so if you have a training age when you're in the strength game, that's awesome to interact with that. As a coach, this is a great thing for you to go and try maybe with a really light plate, like a 10-pound plate, and play with distance of your body from distal from that load. But in this case, we have a relatively short lever, and so we take up less space, and we can start looking at that constraint space model that we'd like to talk about in a more dynamic sense a little bit.
Right, and when we say constraint space model, I think that's one thing to really call out there.
Yeah.
That is referring to the reflexive stability, right? We're talking about all this RNT type load. That as soon as I lunge with an offset load, whether that's outside or inside, it starts making some things reflexively work. So it's adding a constraint. The offset is adding a constraint that reflexively forces my body to work in a way that has transfer to the real world.
Exactly, because of the heightened level of sensitivity to those variables, right? And so what happens is reflexively, we can do this consciously as well, but ideally we want to let the body do what it's designed to do, which is respond in real time to stimulus and be able to right itself in space, right? And so what happens is these are relatively self-limiting drills where, hey, if you lose your balance, you're likely going to lose your footing. You're going to kind of get thrown off. And so if we're looking at qualitatively defining the movement with control in the PPP, the position pattern power model, or the static fluid dynamic model, when in that middle ground, even before we add a lot of power, right, we're looking at the ability to control the descent, control yourself into that eccentric position, that static position at the bottom.
Cool. So we got about 20 minutes left.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Teach us about this mace, this weapon that I'm holding in my hand.
And historically, it is a weapon. So let's look at that. Let's look at the anatomy of the mace and just defining from the barbell. We look at the loaded component of the mace is the mace head, right? In this case, it's a 15-pound mace in total, and then we have the handle itself. And how we position ourselves relative to the handle is going to dictate largely the perceived load, right? And so as we go through this, it's a very accessible tool because of that short lever length. If we go into a conventional barbell grip, an over grip, just as an example, we can keep a relatively narrow grip and stay proximal to the load, centrated on the handle, right? Handle centrated between the hands, down his midline. He can spread his grip to create more control, or he can move his grip further from the load to amplify the perceived load, right? The load didn't change, but the effective load and the way it's perceived in the body does. And so that's something that we can really highlight. And so as we go through this, let's just go and kind of we do a lot of theming in our courses. So I like to talk about like the history of the mace just a little bit. It is a weapon historically, right? And so when did it come about? Really is a highly effective weapon. It symbolizes strength in certain cultures. It was highly effective when heavy armor came into play, and when swords were no longer effective against heavy armor because the advancement of those armors outpaced some of the weaponry, then maces came in as a highly effective tool against heavy armor. And so when we look at this, I really look at the way that we've interacted with our body, or the lifestyle choices we've made have put a lot of us in an armor that we've had a hard time breaking out of, right? This postural distortion that's driven off text neck and knowledge working as a society, this cross syndrome or forward head positions, all these things. We can look at the mace as a very useful tool to counteracting this armor that we're stuck in. It's almost like a prison of armor, right? Yep. And so as we look at that, we looked at the anatomy, we looked at a little bit of the history. We understand that it's accessible because of relatively short lever and relatively light load, which makes it a more safe introduction to offset load than maybe a barbell would be. Right. And let's kind of look at some positions. As a matter of fact, we didn't have this on here. I'm going to grab my my laptop here, just to make sure we kind of cover some of the positions of the mace. Ah, that's what it was.
Printed front and back.
Oh, so efficient. Here we go. Awesome. So let's look at some of the positions of the mace. I think that's a really good way to understand how the mace is unique to some degree. You're not going to find some of these positions in a barbell very easily.
And to call out quickly, you all have access to this handout. If you haven't seen it, it's already been attached to the webinar. You're still not sure, email Colin Young at continuousimprovement@teamexos.com. He's on right now listening. You can get it. We're not going to hit every single position. There's a lot of them. That would cache the remaining 15, 20 minutes, and we want to show some really fun little flows and things you can do with this. So
definitely,
we're going to hit a few quickly, then get to the movement with the mace, but you have this to access.
Perfect. So let's just look at vertical orientation in the mace. A lot of times what we're going to look at is defining grips before we look at the particular position. So in this case, we're going to look at hand positions, right? The grip. The one hand proximal to the loaded side is the first hand that we call out. So in this case, this is an in grip, vertical down the midline, right? And now we have a vertical front. This is vertical front. We have a vertical side. So we can go to the cross side. This is across from the dominant hand, the top hand, right? And then we have the traditional side position as well. All right, so now with the grips, we can do that same vertical orientation, but we do an out in. So an out will be your first hand crossing over. Exactly. So now you see he's predisposed to some rotary type of movements in this configuration. This transfers into a over grip as the mace rotates a lot of times. So now we have a vertical front with an out in grip configuration, vertical side. So we can go to one side or the opposite side, the cross side. Awesome. So from there we got horizontal, right? So in horizontal, we have a traditional over grip. We'll start with over. First over is the hand proximal to the load. Second over is the hand distal from the load, right? So over, and we have an over bottom position, over middle position, which is at the sternum, essentially, pulling the bar back towards the midline. Over top position, which is like a rack position, and then overhead position. Awesome. So now just let's highlight, we have a couple different grip configurations, but the one most commonly used besides the over grip is going to be the under over grip. And this creates that push-pull kind of environment. So the lever wants to rotate, and Stefan's pulling on this side and pushing down the opposite side to stabilize the bar in a horizontal configuration. In the same situation, we have the low position, the mid position, the high position, and then an overhead position with this is not going to be usually bilateral stance. It would be a rotated position just because it's hard for this hand to extend directly overhead, right? Awesome. So in addition to that, we can look at rotated positions, right? Or angled positions. So just right there, just in this configuration, under, over, and we call this a crossbody top position. The top calling out what? The relative position of the mace head. Now, if we want to do crossbody bottom, essentially there you go. It's like a seat belt crossing over the midline and the sternum, going from one shoulder to opposite hip. Now let's get back into a horizontal, right? Now we can look at a rotated position. So we can rotate to the right in this position, boom, great. Or we can rotate to the left, right? So moving towards the load or moving away from the load. In each case, he's still in the middle component, middle configuration, and an over grip, but he's rotating either to the open side or the closed side. Awesome. So we look at a lot of these variables and we can look at, well, geez, that was only just one side of load. It's all the same thing on the opposite side, but what you'll find out is with this asymmetrical load, this offset load, there's a lot of information. You'll probably find that the structural challenge is differing from one side to the other.
Absolutely.
And so, since we're going to be running low on time, let's just go ahead and work on some fun stuff.
So show me how to apply all this.
Wonderful.
Some progressions, regressions. I got a large group of people in a corporate setting, or I got a class, and I want everybody working. What do we do? How do we change movements up based on the principles we just talked about?
So let's go with something that's going to be relatively familiar, like squat press, right? So let's look over a squat position, over grip, and top position near. So that means near is proximal to the load with this near hand. So if we looked at that, that was squat, right? So squat's the movement base. Try to call that out first, right? And then go ahead and stand. we have an over grip, right? And it's the top position, right? Not overhead, but top position and near. So if we wanted to make this harder, even without changing anything else, we can change the relative position of the bar to the body. The easiest one would be taking it overhead. That doesn't make the drill easy. It means that's an easy way to progress. Let's not do the overhead squat. I think that's going to be pretty hard for most people. Stefan's just showing off now, right? Go ahead and bring it back down. We'll keep it in this top position over, and just change actually something that's more accessible to more people right now. So that would be conventional based on the position of the implement versus the body, right? So now let's just move further from the load, distal from the load. So this is, again, squat over, top position, but further from, and that's relative, right? So you can make small increments. A little bit is a lot when we're changing distance from the load.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's go near again. Okay, so now we can add complexity to the movement, right? So let's make this a squat press. So from the near position, we reset as we added sophistication to the movement. Let's reset our position to the easier position so we don't assume that he's going to be stable in that overhead position from afar. That's going to be very challenging. Yeah, it's going to be very challenging as a matter of fact. So let's go ahead and do a squat press.
Like a soft press from the bottom?
No, actually standing. So squat to press, exactly. Or conventionally these days, weird to say conventionally, call it a thruster now, right?
Right.
So interesting when you're dealing with different demographics, how different segments of population, how they'll call out something very different, right?
Right.
So if we wanted to amplify that same variable that we managed, we can go from near to far in smaller increments, because as we go overhead, it's much more challenging. So let's see, how likely is it for him to stay centrated?
Here,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
So we should do all movement. Oh, sorry, let's see where it's got. We should do all movement on webinars because I can watch myself on the screen.
There you go. And that's kind of fun. All right, so let's just add another variable.
Okay.
All right. So in this case, let's go to a half rotational squat over near. Okay. And in this case, over near. In this case, let's go ahead and look at a pivoted squat. So I know you guys have a variety of rotational drills in terms of the squat. In this case, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have you kind of go into a more like a semi-sumo position, a 45 toe out. And what I'll do is when we squat, I'm gonna have you rotate into a lunge-like position, right?
But this foot stays
But this foot stays planted. Exactly. That's why I want that toe out a little bit, so there's less rotational load on that knee. So pivot, good, and stand, good. So now we get that patterning of the lower body, right? So now we could do pivot to 180 degrees. So down to the right, up to the left. So boom, nice. All right, and maybe now we look at from that 180 degrees of rotation, taking that coiling effect of the lower body and using that as like a push press, a corkscrew-like motion. And now as we press, we're going to have to really control the amount of rotation that the body wants to go. The body wants to over rotate as it takes that mace overhead. You have to lock down that front line of the body and control the amount of rotation that's occurring, right? Not only at the lower body, but at the torso now.
Yeah, and the hips.
And the hips. There's a lot of stuff going on here.
Chubbs is the best strength coach ever. It's all in the hips.
Hey,
feel that.
A little Adam Sandler goes a long way.
Absolutely.
So that's just a kind of a fun way, and even some unconventional, spice to throw into a rotational squat to press kind of progression. What do you have any insight or
no, I think
context to provide?
One of the biggest keys, right, is having a plan when you program and knowing your own personal sort of pluses and minuses in terms of progressions, regressions.
Exactly.
And lateralization. So not harder, but just different for variety. So how can I have 2 up and 2 down? So we've got this group in, and again, I can have, to show those, I can have one person working on their squat. It's only 15 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
I can have another person adding some complexity. Another person's pressing. Another person's pressing. We can start adding different components. We can start having some fun here. And we can work all the way through to here.
Mm-hmm.
And we've built sort of a pathway where for inclusivity, where everyone is challenged at their level. And because we go in as a coach knowing what our ups and downs are, we've got it. Can we go through another one?
Yeah, okay,
Let's
awesome.
More. I like this.
Okay.
That's the first time If you can't tell, we didn't fully rehearse all of these. That's the first time I've done that. I like the way that feels. That's going in my program now.
Awesome. Yeah, those are some of my favorite drills as kind of a warrior lunge kind of concept is what we discussed is, and it's this pivot into rotational loaded positions. How are we doing on time?
We're good. We got 15 minutes to top. We want to leave time for questions.
Okay.
So let's run through more. Let's take us through what do we got.
Let's do a reverse lunge to uppercut progression. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more dynamic, and what we're going to do is look at new positions. So when we introduce new movements, we have to look at the component positions that we're going to hit. So we refine that positional awareness, so we can refine the technique before we even get into even a fluid approach, right?
Key principle into itself, which again we mentioned at the top, right?
Boom,
like,
exactly.
What are my key positions to own to do this?
Exactly.
I want people doing pull-ups. They have to be able to put their arms overhead.
Exactly.
So what have we got for the lunge?
Okay, so let's go ahead and go into a over low position in front. Awesome. All right, so Stefan, I'm going to change my position to you here. I'm going to take the opposite side here, and just for reference here, we're going to take this over front, right, in the low position to a side rotate position to the loaded side hip. All right. Now, if we look at this, I'm going to have Stefan rotate 90 degrees so you guys can see to that wall. I'm sorry. Face that wall, just so they can see the bar relative to your body here. Now, what happens is Stefan has to actively engage us. He's gone through our foundations course, so he knows what I'm looking for, but naturally the bar wants to push forward. Go ahead and let it forward. Yeah, it wants to hang with the weight close to the hip, close to your center of mass.
Sure.
The loaded portion wants to find your center of mass, or you want it to
man's way, right?
Exactly, the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
So this is not a highly engaged position, but this is. Look at this, it looks like an uppercase A with the center of the bar between his hands centered on the body. This is a pull that was required for this, and this is a preloaded position. His body wants to get out of this position. The bar wants to travel in what direction? Forward. So guess what? That's what we're going to end up doing. Let's go ahead and face the camera here. Let's go to a cross-body bottom position here. So cross-body bottom will be the weighted end, and he's crossing the body from shoulder to opposite hip. Look, he makes perfect sense. In this case, what I want him to do is bring that elbow up a little bit higher, because I'm going to actually move and want that elbow tracking, kind of like an elbow tracing over the head right here, okay? So he's pulling the bar apart to create some active engagement, but only to the degree that feels safe. So the amount of ISOs that we utilize have to be relative to the tissue adaptability of that individual, right? Yep. So we could really overpower some of these tissues if we try too hard to cue too much ISOs or too long, especially. All right, so this crossbody bottom position is the second position we're going to reinforce. The next one's going to be a crossbody top, a top position, rotated top position, and the mace head forward. So now look, we have this nice horizontal line. The torso is rotating. The hips are in a relatively stable bilateral position forward. We're going to let the hips rotate as much as necessary and no more to allow for the mace head to be directly in front of the mace handle in this nice configuration. So now if we go through this, we can pattern the transition between those three movements. Crossbody bottom, rotated low side, okay? Boom, crossbody bottom, and rotated top. Boom, 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 right? Hey, guess what? That's our uppercut. So now we pattern position, and now let's try to smooth out the transition, keeping it close to the body, right? So position, now pattern, transitioning from technical 1, 2, 3 to 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Lots of rotation happening here. Hey, let's add a new variable. Okay, so in this side load position, this is something we call this rotated bottom position, is side load because it's, remember that preload pull. Now let's just step back with the left foot into a lunge.
Left foot?
Yes, sir. Boom. And still maintaining this pull, so it's still this A frame. Notice the torso rotation is occurring. This torso rotation is amplifying rotational load at the base leg as well. This leg is working against rotational stability in a very nice way. So stand up and just to crossbody bottom. So let's go ahead and do that again. Step back, and
remember, I can choose the intent I'm bringing here, right?
Yeah.
So I can certainly do this in a lazy fashion, but I can really work to own these positions, hold posture, create tension on the tool,
and also on your feet. If I want to make
create
it
an arch, grab the ground.
Exactly. Grab the ground, split the ground apart, pull the ground together, see which one gives you more stability to step out of that position. I think that's something that we always want to highlight as well, is we can choose how to engage the ground at all times. Using your ground reactive force is super useful. So now if we went from that rotated lunge position, We can go rotated lunge to crossbody bottom, right? So let's go and do that. Rotated lunge, crossbody bottom, boom, and right back in. So using that descent, this is now we're using some of that RNT concept, right? So we're using the acceleration of the load down and back to give you that constraint of being reflexive in response to that accelerated load in descent, right? And you feel that there's actually that righting mechanism that's naturally happening. The body, there you go, has to find a way to stabilize in response to that. And every rep's slightly different. All right, so now we can go from there to the uppercut position, the uppercut finish position. Boom, and then step 2, step 1. Good. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. So what happens in one direction happens in reverse order, the opposite direction. And guess what? There's a lot of work going on here. And go ahead and rest, Stefan. I know you're a little off kilter now. One hip has definitely worked a lot harder than the other. We'll let you do that off camera. But I think that that's a really fun thing because you know, the barbell, you can't cross the body that way with a 7-foot barbell.
Right.
And now we are starting to see that the type of the unique configuration of this tool allows for that to occur a lot more safely. The load limitations of the tool allow for it to happen a lot more safely. It's a more ideal tool to introduce these offset concepts, I feel, especially in a larger environment or in a confined environment, right? A larger environment in terms of people, right? Groups. It's a lot easier to get groups of people to move this than that in a confined space. And if you're really in a tight space with high traffic, is definitely not something you want to be doing with the barbell. And if you do something like this, then I would put yourself back against the wall in a corner so you can account for at least 2 directions. And as a coach, I control everything beyond here, right? So managing safety is not just about managing load and technique, but also managing space, especially as we're moving in rotational patterns or taking anything that's more dynamic in a change of position, right? Taking a position, hey, an injury in a big lateral lunge is going to occur if I step on somebody's foot that shouldn't have been there when I stepped there, right? So controlling space is such a big part of this. And the last thing I would say is really easy. If we look at transitioning from one side of the body to the other, crossing midline, this is another thing you wouldn't do with the barbell very easily. But if we just take that basically under over grip, so under, see, look, so easy as we keep things consistent, under, proximal to load, over, and we're in this middle configuration at the sternum, essentially, right? Hey, guess what? Now you can pull the bar apart. Boom. So as he pulls the bar apart, he's pulling closer to his body. So getting close to the body. Now we transition from one side to the other pretty easily here. We take the distal hand and we slide it up the mace head to the mace head in midline. We call this a prayer position. So prayer hands essentially. And then we're going to slide the top hand down the handle on the opposite side. And ideally, you'll hear contact the whole time. There you go. So go ahead and transition. Boom, boom. Good. And naturally, as he changes position, as it crosses midline, the hands move a little bit further away. And as he re-engages, he pulls the bar back into midline. All right, so that's a great switch. And crossing midline is highly dynamic for the nervous system. It makes you think a lot, changes the push-pull configuration of the hand. In this, we can look at squatting, lunging, and that adds a dynamic load, right? Boom, boom. And then what about a lunge? Boom. Yeah.
Walking lunge. Coming right at you.
Whoa, whoa. Remember, that's a weapon. You're scaring people on screen.
And we even talked about, we've been playing around in the facility, using it as a perturbation, get static in a position on the bottom. And now.
Wow, that's a lot of work, even though it's not a lot of movement of the body. That perturbation, I'm never good at that word. It adds a lot of dynamic, like reactive, reflexive demand to that lower body in a static position. I mean, if you think isos are hard without any load or even just holding a static load, start moving that thing around across that midline, and wow, there's a lot of work that has to be that's demanded of the body.
Absolutely. So if we look at it, whether we're talking about dumbbell, barbell offset, a mace, we change the way we interact with the implement.
Yep.
Here, 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 here.
Yep.
We've changed our body's position in space. Things here, 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 right? Mm-hmm. We've changed the velocity of things, working from really owning some static positions through to,
and gradually patterning and then adding some power. So now driving off that front foot and really creating that rotational load. But when would we do that? Only after we do step 1 and 2 to qualify that we're not shooting a cannon from a canoe, right?
Right. So the takeaway for everyone, and then we'll get to questions. Whether you're using offset load or not, change where it is in relation to your body, change your body's position, change your velocity, and own isometrics and key positions first.
Yep.
The next takeaway is that offset load amplifies all of that and puts us in this constraint-based RNT model that builds us increased reflexive stability. But we don't need a mace to do it.
Don't need a mace to do it.
But if you want a mace, okay, we're working on rollout plans for the company. That's to be determined, different sites. That's a bigger story than just this webinar. It's going to be different everywhere. But for your own garage gym, if you want to play with this, Onnit has given us wholesale pricing, which is phenomenally generous on all of their implements. And if you're not sure how to take advantage of that, whether it's for their education courses, wholesale pricing for equipment, or they are primarily our nutrition supplement partner. If you want to know about those things, email me at continuousimprovement@teamexos.com, and I'll make sure I get you pointed in the right direction. I want to get time for some live questions.
Yep.
I've got you on camera. We'll see what's coming. We got a few minutes here.
We got a bunch. Stefan, I can jump in and ask them so you don't have to stand up front.
Perfect. And remember, we're recording this, so we want to make sure we finish on time. If you've got a group coming up and you need to jump, that's fine. This will be recorded and you can watch at the end. If you're able to stick around, we'll go for as long as there's questions.
Perfect.
But on that, in case people do have to jump, Coach John Wolf, it's an absolute pleasure having you in. I've really enjoyed our time so far, learning about each other's systems. Thanks for taking the time. Colin, what do you got for John?
Yeah, I'd say there's two big questions that I'll start with that kind of most of the questions fell into these buckets. The first one is, where in our programming, and Stefan, you might be able to kind of speak to this a little bit, where does it fit? Does it have its own day? Is it part of a recovery? Is it going to a rotational or auxiliary block? Understanding that there might not be as neural of a demand, so it wouldn't necessarily go in some type of primary power block. So where does that fit necessarily kind of within a training day or our system?
Yes. Next question. No, I'm joking. Look, wherever. So look, there are going to be natural places it fits better. So I've been playing with this for about 5 months on my own now. I've been down to the foundations course, and I personally have found immense value in my pillar prep, movement prep, believe it or not, just to have a little bit of increased capacity in movement prep and variety. If I was getting bored of the same old, going through some basic flows with the lightest mace and a very a close, not a super challenging position, but someone just like those switch squats. So pillar prep, movement prep for sure, because of that RNT constraint-based nature. Rotary and auxiliary for sure. Once you've earned it, ESD, it's been fantastic to get my heart rate up, but you have to earn those positions. It shouldn't be day one, let's do this and introduce fatigue. But it can in time work into that. Those would be the key places. From there, though, recovery day, absolutely. It's some three-dimensional novel movement, which is great for the brain, great to offset psychological stress and monotony without too much of a load. The one place where it may not fit, and it depends on who you're working with, is at the end of the day, it is only 15 pounds. If I'm talking like max strength, it may not be the tool for my primary or my secondary block.
Yeah.
But having said that, if I'm working with someone who's rehabbing, sedentary, foundational introduction to exercise, it very well could be their primary or secondary block. So you've got to look at what's right for you.
And the only thing I would say is, as you introduce this concept, don't underestimate the power in introducing offset load, even in a shorter lever and relatively light load tool like the mace, even a 10-pound mace. The amount of volume and the uniqueness of the loading, the load that you're experiencing in terms of the configuration of that load is something that I'd recommend doling out in small and progressively larger doses, incrementally and with some discretion for yourself and for your athletes or clients.
Yeah, and I'm going to put someone on the spot here. I won't name names, but we've got our team at Motiva has been playing with some of these. We did a course at Motiva and we got some equipment in there. So we've got a corporate site that's working as a pilot study. So if you do have access to these, or if you're going to get them and you want to know more about these, reach out to me and let's do a better job of learning from each other and peer-to-peer type work and connectivity within the company. And we can start having conversations around what have been initial lessons learned in a corporate environment for us what are the key takeaways after the first couple months. It's new to us, but we're having a lot of fun seeing how it fits in.
Definitely.
What else you got, Colin?
Yeah, that actually leads perfectly into the second bucket of questions, was maybe expanding upon the option of what do I do if I don't have the mace or even barbells. So you guys kind of touched on the dumbbell early on. I think some people jumped on a little bit late, so maybe missed that initial part as well. So maybe just expand upon how you could introduce these same concepts, especially the rotational elements that you brought in there, right? The mace going over the lunge, etc., without having the ability to use a mace, and maybe limited access to a barbell.
So you want to?
Yeah, I mean,
let's
maybe we can look at it from two different perspectives and see if we're thinking along the same lines. But a lot of times, you know, in what I've seen within Exo's facilities, and maybe this is just a subset I've been exposed to, but looking at pneumatic resistance as an opportunity to do that with like a chop bar or something like that, loaded on one side. The same concept is there to some degree, or band loaded with an anchor.
So it doesn't need to be pneumatic, right? So
exactly.
We've got bands, and so any of our work with bands, which we've got some bands here, the dumbbell, making sure you're doing single, you know, isolateral dumbbell. So like a one-arm dumbbell bench, a one-arm. So let's
do the bench. Yeah.
Let's show some things here, right? So, and again, if you need to jump, you can jump. We'll keep rolling. This is all recorded, but like one of our favorites.
Here you go, sir.
Is to get not only, so by definition, this is an offset load. If I now want to amplify it, I can offset myself off the bench.
See how his shoulder blade's located, centrated on the center of the bench now. And so this amplifies the rotational stability demand by quite a big degree.
Right. If I want to now make it harder, I go away from midline further so I can do a fly. Oh, right. So we've got that. If you don't have a bench and dumbbell even, the whole point is offsetting off of center of mass. If we have, I'm not saying that we've got our clients doing one-arm push-ups. Hear me out here though. If you're at a fun get-together back in the day, someone challenges you to a one-arm push-up, what does that typically look like?
Dipping and
super
dropping.
Wide legs, hand-centered dipping. That is the equivalent, bringing myself on a one-arm push-up, right, to really get to here, which is horrible for the shoulder.
Yeah.
That's which is what most people would do if you said that.
Yeah.
That's the equivalent of letting this offset swing to here.
Exactly.
So now, how can we put that into training? And this is something we can all do. If you've got a rack, a barbell, a wall, we all know that this is now much easier push-up. Agreed? So if I do this in a rack with a barbell, but you can go on the wall, that's much easier push-up. Now we can worry about positions. So put people in a position of saying, okay, your hands are in place for how you do a push-up. Take one hand off and don't move anything else. And you're not allowed to let your hips shift or move around. And all of a sudden, there's an offset load. If I've got a bench, a bar you can get over, you're right down to it. And all of a sudden, you offset load a push-up by going to a one-arm push-up, but elevating the angle to where it is accessible with Gen Pop. I've done that with Gen Pop, just at a very elevated angle here. And it isn't strength here, it's rotational stability.
Yeah.
So I would say if you don't have the mace, offset load. If you have a barbell, it doesn't even have to be fully loaded versus unloaded. You're bench pressing, throw 5 extra pounds on one side and avoid any shift of the bar. You don't have barbells, use your dumbbells, but make sure you're doing things with just one and start paying attention to whether it's ipsilateral, contralateral, and where it's loaded.
And what your body's doing relative to that load too. So if you're loaded on one side and the shoulder's dropping, that's a lack of rotational stability as well, right?
Right.
So we're gonna create the illusion that you're evenly loaded, right? You're bilaterally loaded. And so that means shoulders, hips, and even the knee position relative to the foot. We want to make sure that it's all tracking and looking exactly like it would if you were evenly loaded on both sides.
Yeah. So the key point to that is you're all already doing offset load. Unilateral carries, suitcase carries, rack carries, overhead carries, one-arm dumbbell work. That's all offset. The point of this webinar is to then say, how can we take those principles, or how can we identify the principles there to start making things more challenging? You can do it with barbells. What we get with this accessible tool of the mace is we can make things typically a lot more dynamic once you're in those positions. But you take even, got slides in here? you take a slide and you start doing push-ups, right? Of course I did upper body. Yes.
Okay, yeah,
You start doing push-ups where you let one arm work out. The tendency will be to want to shift over and you don't allow it.
Yeah.
So we can start playing with different push-up variations. And again, if you're going, wait a minute, population work, we can't do that, go back to my elevated push-up idea on a bar and not letting your hands center over your body, but play that. Again, I've done that with Gen Pop and they love it. It's a great, they'll be like, that's smoking my core. Like that's an ab exercise. You're like, yep, we're working on core.
And generally it's accessible to some degree. So like if they get just a 15-degree bend in the elbow and they're sliding out from there, that's going to be a lot more accessible than being all the way into a flexed arm position, right?
To that point, not do the full push-up, right? We
Yes.
make it static on this side. Exactly. Yeah, I like that.
And same thing with the mace. There's nothing that says that you have to go full range all the time. You work within the ranges that are owned, and that's what that pattern component is. Or sorry, the position before patterning is like, hey, let's understand what the depth of this person's capacity is in this position. If it's a squat or if it's a lunge position, whatever the case is, we can, before we even get them to move through the position from end range to end range, let's know where the end ranges are. End range is defined by, defining the end range by what end range can they own, right? And so rather than just an ideal or arbitrary definition of what end range should look like is different than what it should look like for that individual.
Yeah. Like I said, a lot of this is things I'm sure people are already doing, but I just hope that it maybe sparks some new thoughts of like, yeah, I can do a better job of varying how I interact with the load. I can do better thought of varying the velocity or bringing isometrics in, not just always varying velocity from from fluid to dynamic, but regressing down to static and applying that, and then hopefully offset load, open some ideas. And you got some fun things to play with, because at the end of the day, not only is it a great training technique, we need to have variety for our clientele, right? We aren't entertainers, don't get me wrong, that's not what we're doing. But we do have to keep people engaged, and variety is a key piece for that.
Well, something that I learned from you as we were on the road show in Texas was the concept of psychological stress, right? And fatigue of doing the same things repetitiously, training monotony, and how we've also discussed that even though we're not there to entertain, are you not entertained? But it is important to acknowledge that we're dealing with humans, and psychology around training is a huge thing that we can understand better and manage these variables in a way where you're doing the same with just enough difference so that they're consciously engaged in the process, that they're back at a point where they're not just mindlessly doing anything.
It's like you say, right? Psychology trumps physiology.
Psychology trumps physiology oftentimes. Yeah.
Awesome. Colin, any other questions?
Yeah, these should be a little bit quicker, but definitely have a few more to get to. So again, for those who have to jump on, go for it. We will record this. Yep. So from a progression regression standpoint, when you're introducing offset loading, do you go more of a especially when you're using dumbbells and kettlebells, do you go more of a light offset? So instead of two 35s, you get a 35 and a 30. And then how does that play in with, okay, a fully offset, just one dumbbell or kettlebell, and then also the positioning that you talked about? So how do you guys progress from like first introduction to a little bit more advanced, specifically using those dumbbells and kettlebell movements?
Lightning round.
Go. Lightning round. Okay, so oftentimes if somebody is not able to centrate themselves with even a single offset load, then a lot of times getting them bilaterally loaded is going to be a lot easier for them to at least understand where center is. And then we will do exactly like you said, like say 70 pounds of total weight isn't outrageous for them, but a single 35-pound is in terms of their ability to stabilize their body. So we'll just go 35, 35, 30, 35, 25, 35, and scale down, where the reality is this demand is what they're having a hard time controlling. And so we can kind of increase the difference between load on one side and the other, and through that means kettlebell or dumbbell pretty easily.
Awesome. What else we got?
There's a question about resources from a movement library perspective. Do you guys have something that's available either to Exos employees specifically or as a whole, other than social media? I believe it sounds like they already follow you guys on Instagram, probably seen you a couple times on there, John.
Right now, social media is a great resource, and YouTube as well. They've got a lot of resources, yes. We actually just had a meeting, part of John being out here. We just had a meeting yesterday, and we're working on how to get digital assets into our movement library. to have access. Now, again, if you don't have access to that, email us. I want to get people turned on to that. It's a great tool, the APML, Athletes Performance Movement Library. We just haven't named it from back in the day because it's an internal resource. But we're working on getting their digital resources. Right now, we're talking about 150 movements between steel clubs and the mace. I believe about 90 mace and 60 steel clubs. So it's coming very shortly. But in the meantime, social media and YouTube is probably a great avenue, right?
Yeah, and just qualifying that statement is like a lot of things that we're putting on social media, you're going to have to deduce and backtrack from an example of where someone is in the process versus like what are the components, what are the positions, let's go back and just reverse engineer what you're seeing rather than take it at face value and try to approximate a skill that likely you or someone else might not be necessarily ready for. But if you use the same principle-based approach that we highlighted here that you've been taught within the Exos system, then you can reverse engineer any movement skill. And I think that's really what the basis of a lot of this is.
And that's what we want. So what one mace movement did we not talk about today?
The 360.
360, right? Overhead swinging it. What does every coach or every person want to do when they first put their hands on a mace?
Oh, 360.
But does the 360, is it dynamic, fluid, or static?
It's dynamic.
Very dynamic.
Yeah.
Does it work through many different key landmark positions?
Oh my gosh.
And we haven't worked on owning those yet. So that's sort of one of those key takeaways, right? Like I'm guilty. Before I had a chance to interact with these guys, I'm going to throw Omi under the bus even of day one. I was like, Omi, show me how to use this because he knows a lot. And we went over some 360, which that's not Omi's fault. That was me badgering him like an annoying person. But my point is that's human nature to want to play. And it's our responsibility. I've now learned as I've been nowhere near mastering. It's still very much a student. But over the last 5 months playing with it, I've learned I was premature in going to that because I was just swinging it unwieldy. And you want to earn those positions. So look at social media, but yeah, regress it back to key positions. Don't just start going these like flows and swinging things around.
And just to be fair, traditional use of the mace was limited to 360s and 10-2s, which was like an angular stop position of a 360. And these overhead swings were really the basis of all traditional mace training historically, because there's a lot of history to mace training for wrestling and combative athletes or even soldiers. And so in that case, from a traditional model, that's true. Now we've just re-architected a whole training system around using the mace, and that training, the lens we look through just happens to be very well aligned with the Exos training system. So it's hard to put context to a new tool sometimes, and so hopefully that this presentation provides a lot more context for you to explore safely with this new tool.
Absolutely. Any other questions, Colin?
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. John bookended it really well there. So
perfect. Thank you. So we are, as always, I'm taking John for the day.
Raw.
All right. So we are going to film more supplemental videos to go on with this. So we will give you more movements, more concepts, more content. We'll put those attached to this recorded webinar. If you have any questions, as always, reach out to us at continuousimprovement@teamexos.com. Thank you for joining us. Next month, we've got error identification and correction. I just saw a presentation from Kelly Starrett that was lights on, saying if we can't identify error in movement and correct it, we're part of the problem, right? Like we need to get people moving properly. So really excited to dive into that. Please join. Tell your coworkers to join. We'll make it worthwhile. John.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Nat, we'll see you next month.